Yo, what is going on, fam? Keezy here from Black Market, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about Reactor. There's a lot to cover in this video. We're going to go over everything from the most basic fundamentals of Reactor, and then we're also going to cover some more advanced topics, and I'm going to show you some different techniques. Most questions you might have will be answered in this. Even questions you didn't know you needed answers to, we will talk about those and we will answer them. All of that and more in today's video. Let's do it. Let's start off by talking about the UI of Reactor. In Reactor, you have what is called the action bar, and this is your settings here at the top. So you have a Save Map button. Clicking this button will save your current document as a new displacement map and add it to your saved maps library. So there it is. This is your settings button. If you click this, it will drop down more options that you can play with to customize Reactor's effect further to your liking. The play button, of course, is how you actually run Reactor, and you'll notice hovering or clicking on it does nothing. The reason for this is because we don't have a map selected. So this button will only activate if you have a map selected, because you need a map selected in order to run Reactor. So with the map selected, we can just click play, and we get a result instantly. And of course, the nature of Reactor is that every image that you choose produces a different result. So if we just scroll through the list here and click different images, we get a different result for each one, right? And that makes sense. This is the power bar. This is how you control how intense the effect is. For example, if I do 500 and I run that, we get something that is completely indistinguishable, yeah, I think that's right. Completely indistinguishable from the original. And then if we turn this down to something like 10, the effect is pretty subtle. And we can actually go even lower than that. If we hold Control, you'll notice that we're able to move in increments of only 1 at a time. By default, it's increments of 10. And if we hold Shift, we snap to increments of 50. It's up to you. It's a preference thing. But just know that. Let's talk a little bit about how the X and Y power goes. So the power bar controls both values. The reason for this is because I think 90% of the time, 80% of the time, you're going to want to just quickly set the power and go. And so we did this to make it very, very easy to use Reactor's core function. But if you want more control, for example, if you only wanted an effect to work on the Y-axis, then you could just turn the Y up and turn the X off, and then you're only going to get vertical distortion. And similarly, you could do that with the X-axis, so you're only going to get horizontal distortion there. So that's something to be aware of. As you adjust these independently, the power bar will change to reflect those. Note that the actual intensity meter doesn't have anything to do with the values if they're set independently. Once you use the power bar again to control, it's going to overwrite both of your preset values and control them in sync again. You have animate, loop, and your frame count here. So by toggling this, you would get an animation effect. And by toggling loop, you would get an animation that, just like the name suggests, loops. So we'll convert this to a smart object for a better result. And then we'll just click play, and then this will animate. In order to actually see your animation, you need to go to Window, Timeline, and then you can skip back to frame 1 and then press play, and there's your animation. A question we get asked a lot about animation is, how do I export it after I've made it? It's very easy. You go File, Export, Render Video, and then the default settings here are always what I use, though I'm sure somebody that's more fluent in video related stuff would know whether to change any of this. Okay, moving on. If you wanted to export it as a GIF, you could go Window, Export, or File, Export, Save for Web Legacy, and then GIF from this little drop down. By changing this colors, you can reduce the file size fairly significantly. For something that's only a black and white logo, you don't really need more than like 8 colors, so you'll be able to reduce the file size of the GIF by a good margin if you do that. Let's talk a little bit about these fitting options now. This is something a little bit more advanced that I think is important to talk about. So by default, and I'm gonna demonstrate this here by opening up an image, this is our displacement map. Okay, it's a square image, and this is our content. It's sort of ultra landscape, short, very wide, right? And so when we paste this design on, you can see exactly where it's going to affect. Now with stretch, Reactor is essentially going to stretch that image to fit the canvas. And because this canvas is also a square, it basically is just centering it and putting it exactly how you would expect. And so if we lower the opacity here, what you see right here, this is exactly where Reactor is going to affect the image because it stretches it across the entire canvas and runs it right there. So if we click play, this is exactly what we saw by placing the image on top and positioning it there. It's the exact same location for the displacement. However, if we then make a selection, if we select like this, what's going to happen? Well, the image is actually going to stretch to fit this. So it's not going to run the segment that we see in there. It's not going to do this. It's going to actually do something more like this. So it's going to be stretching this to fit that area. So now if we actually select that, you'll be able to see here that that's exactly what it does. It's stretching this to fit in that area. And you can see very clearly here that when I lower the opacity on this, you're able to, especially if you focus right here, you can see exactly where this image is affecting our Reactor text. Okay, so that's a really important thing to understand, is that the default behavior is that it stretches. So if you have an image that is wide, so this one's square as well. Do I have something wide in here? Say we had an image, or say we had a map that was like this, right? And we save this, okay. And then now this is my delivery displacement map. So I'm going to select it and paste it in here. And this is what Reactor is going to do. So when Reactor runs this, it's going to stretch it like, not like that, like this, okay? So you're going to lose the proportions of the image. It's going to stretch it to fit the entire area that it's able to run on. So when you run it, you're going to get something like this. And you can see here in some of the letters that the typography from the underlying map has been stretched. And it's because we're running a non-square map on a square canvas. So what you can do is make a selection that is more in line with the shape of the map. So now if I run it, we get a little bit less distortion. It's probably even a bit more narrow. How about that? And we can do that to get a little bit less of a distorted effect. So I hope that's not too complicated here for this early in the video. It's just an important thing to understand. Stretch really means stretch. So it takes it and stretches it to fit the canvas. It doesn't just center it. It actually stretches the proportions too. And with a selection, if you make a selection, it stretches the map to fit the selection. So if we were to overlay the map here, what we'd be seeing is something like this, because we are on stretch. Now, if we switch this to tile, the behavior is different. On tile, what you're going to get is the displacement map actually stretching across the entire canvas, or not stretching, just tiling. So if the displacement map is bigger, like it is here, it's going to tile like this. You might not even get the whole thing in. If it's smaller, you're going to get a very repeating pattern. So you're going to get something like this, where it's just going to repeat the map. And this depends on the size of the map versus the size of either your selection or your canvas or both, because the size of your selection is going to be somewhat dependent on the size of your canvas. So really important to understand that if you want to get specific selections. So just to demonstrate why this matters so much, I'm going to choose a map here, and then I'm going to show you how we're able to position it exactly how we want. So here, for example, we have chains. I can click play on chains, and this is what we get. It's kind of cool, but there's some stretching involved, and it's also not positioned exactly how I would like it. So I'm going to go to chains, and then I'm going to click edit to open up the image, and then I'm going to select it and copy it back in here. And then I'm going to do Command T and then scale it down. And then I can manually choose where I want this effect to be. So I'm going to lower my opacity so I can see what I'm doing. And then now if I select it, notice where the chains are. Notice where the chains are. Okay, now if I make a selection of that, that is exactly where Reactor is going to run it. And the image is going to be in the same exact position because we made a selection of the map itself. Right? Our map selection, or our selection, is of the size of the map. So when we go stretch, it's going to stretch it completely proportionally inside the bounds of the selection. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's reduce the power here and then run that. And then you'll see that the chains affect it exactly where we set them to. Now if we overlay the image again, you can see perfectly that the chains are lining up. So I'm not going to spend any more time on the idea of stretching and tiling, but I want you to take away the importance of this, few minutes. I spent a lot longer talking about this than maybe would be expected, but it's because it's very important, and it's something that I don't think really many people understand. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm just going to go back so we get our original artwork here. Okay, so another thing to mention is if you want your displacement to be non-destructive, you can convert whatever you're displacing to a smart object, and then when you run Reactor, you're going to get these nodes here that you can actually delete just by dragging them to the trash, dragging them to the trash, dragging them to the trash. And you can also double click in them to adjust them, and you can mess with things like the opacity and do all of that, but it has to be a smart object for that to work. Another important note to make is that if it is a smart object, the stretch behavior or the selection behavior isn't exactly as expected. So certain things really only do work if it's rasterized. It's just limits with Photoshop, honestly, at this point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these settings that we have in here. We talked about fitting. What is blank areas? So this is referring to undefined areas of your selection. So if I rasterize my layer again, and I think depending on whether you're using a smart object or rasterized layer affects this a little bit. So if we make a selection here, and then we've got some undefined areas here in the top, and we go to a higher power there, and we run this, I'll use this map as an example, on wrap, it's going to actually be pushing our content down about 300 pixels. And then it's going to decide based on this input what to do with essentially the undefined areas. So if we push this down 300 pixels, it's going to wrap it back to the top because we have wrap selected. So if I play that, you'll see what's happening. It's coming down and then wrapping it all the way until that 300 pixel Y strength is met. And it's doing it also on the X-axis there. And if we turn X off, we can see it only happens on the Y. And depending on the strength value we have, this is going to happen less and less. If we only are going down 110, it's splitting the difference there. But what if we have repeat? In this case, it's not going to wrap it. It's going to move it. And then if there's nothing on the edge, it's just going to repeat transparency. If there is edge information, it's going to repeat the edge pixels. So you can see in this particular case, it moves it down. It can tell that the edge pixels are transparent. And because of that, nothing happens. It just repeats transparent. So it remains transparent. So depending on the effect that you want, sometimes wrap is nice. It is the default. For glitch, it's really nice. You get these cool kind of offset juxtaposition glitch effects, which looks nice. But that's not always what you're going for, and in that case where that's not what you're going for, just know that turning this on to repeat will stop it from duplicating your content. That's the main takeaway here. We've got one more option to check out in our settings menu, and it's this blur on save option. What does blur on save mean? Okay, if I just go to Unsplash and check out something from the featured here, this is kind of a cool image, and I have blur on save checked, and then I save the map to my library. Before saving, Reactor is going to give me the opportunity to blur the map as much as I want, and this really helps with noise pretty significantly. If you blur something before saving it as a displacement map, you'll get more of a kind of a warp effect and less of a grungy noise effect, if that makes sense. So you'll see there what happens on blur now. And of course, you can go back and you can actually edit it just by clicking this edit button. And then we can go filter, and I'm going to duplicate it so I don't damage anything. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then this time 5 or even 10 just to exaggerate this. And then I save it again. Or if I save it from here, it'll actually update the thumbnail too. Whoops. I had blur on save there, so re-blurred it. Okay, now if I go and run this again, it's going to be even more blurred. And so we're getting a more wobbly effect, less of a noisy effect. So if I go back and just, this is with less blur, this is with more blur. The original unblurred image would be significantly more noisy than either of these. And so let's just look at that now. Okay, now let's run the unblurred. Now if we just play this, so this is no blur, this is 10 pixel blur, and this is like 2 or 3. So if you're finding yourself getting a lot of fine noise that you don't really want, the blur on save option helps cut that out a little bit. Of course, you can manually edit a map and go in and do whatever you want to it. So if you wanted to use like a filter reduce noise, or if you wanted to literally just draw on the map, you could do that just by opening it up, drawing on it, and then clicking save. And you can see that there now. And if I go back and I play this, now we're going to have our drawing there in the middle, and it actually created kind of a cool effect. So something to note, you can edit maps, you can change the way that they influence your design by making those edits. So blurring will reduce noise, you can edit them, you can add your own text or images or effects, whatever you want to do. They're just images that are saved, and then Photoshop uses them to displace the artwork, and that's the size of it, okay? So now that we're talking about saving maps, let's talk about naming maps. If you save a map, and I've got one here called Untitled 1, I'm going to delete that. If you want to save a map, like your own custom image as a map, you just click this Save Map icon. You'll see it immediately appears there. Now, if you save it again, you'll get this little pop-up that says the name is in use, please enter a different name. And you can just type in a different name here. So I'll type in Untitled 2. And now we have Untitled 2 there. So, but what if I want to save it as something other than the document name to begin with? You just hold Shift and then click it. And now you can enter any name you want. So now we've got test, and then I could save this again. This same thing applies for images from Unsplash. So if I search an image on Unsplash and then I shift click the save button, it will save that Unsplash image from Unsplash directly to my maps library. So I don't have to constantly re-download it every time I want to use it, and I can add it to my library for later use. And this is a feature that I use all the time with Unsplash. I've got some images here, and if I wanted to click this one, I wanted to call this one something like, I don't know, trippy. I can click OK. It's gonna run its thing, connecting to Unsplash. And then I can see it here, trippy.psd. Click edit. I can edit it and do all that good stuff. I could crop it down if I wanted this to be square, and that will reduce distortion. Then I can save it again. If you have a map already that has a name like trippy.psd, so if I go in here and I try to click save, it's going to prompt me to enter a different name. If you just click cancel or OK, it'll just overwrite it with the same name and a new image. So if you don't always want to name it, you don't have to. Reactor can do a little bit of that automatically for you. I'm just going to close some of these out. Okay, what else is there to talk about? Let's talk about selecting and deleting maps. So if I select a map, I can click delete selected map to clean up my panel a little bit. I can also hold shift to select multiple maps, and then holding shift, I can click a map to unselect it. So you can select and deselect multiple maps by holding shift, and then you can just click delete selected map, and it will delete all of your currently selected maps. So that's something to be aware of. Filtering options, you have a few here. We might make this more robust in the future. We're thinking about groups, but for now we want to keep Reactor easy to use, not complicated with all that stuff. But yeah, you can favorite maps just by clicking the star icon, very easy, and then show favorites, and it will only show you maps that you've manually selected favorite map. This should persist between opening and closing Photoshop and doing all that stuff. And then you can change your view options, so you're viewing one up at a time, one in a row, or two in a grid view. We might also add an option for 3x3. Some people have suggested that. You can flip the order of them. If you want to see later maps first, you just flip the order. And so that's basically what we have as far as sorting options. And yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Unsplash now. Unsplash is built into Reactor XL. What this means is that you can search for all of the images on Unsplash directly from Reactor and use them as displacement maps. So if I wanted to displace my logo with this cool image, I could just click play. And there is the result that we have. But every time I click play, it's going to re-download that image. So if I wanted to save that for future use, I would click the save map icon. It's going to do the same thing, and then it's going to save that map now to my library. Okay, fam, so that is really it for today's Reactor basics and fundamentals tutorial. In the future, we will talk a little bit more about specific effects. Like I think I'll walk through 5, 10 different effects that you can create with Reactor, and I'll show you the maps, the intensity settings, etc. that I use to get those effects. But for now, this is everything that you need to know about how to use the tool to create your own effects, okay? If you like this video, definitely please subscribe to the channel. Helps us grow the channel. Why wouldn't you want us to help us grow our channel? Very important stuff there. If you're interested in getting this tool, you can do so at beta.blackmarket.co/reactor. I'm out.